Nation.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. It's a new year. Had a little hiatus, and boy, I tell you, there's a lot to talk about. And actually, we're going to start out on kind of a sentimental note, in that we are bidding bye-bye to Betsy Russell. Here's how Clark Corbin from the Idaho Capital Sun puts it: the dean of the Idaho Press Corps signs off. And this is wonderful in the sense that, Betsy is enjoying a well-deserved retirement at this point. She says she's going to be spending time up on the slopes of Bogus Basin and skiing and enjoying the weekday sunshine. And hey, I wish her the very best. But there are a couple of things that need to be said as she rides off into the sunset, and in particular pertaining to Clark Corbin's article, giving her this wonderful send-off, because it's okay. Let's just dive right into the article. First and foremost, Betsy really did have a marvelous career, a very long-term reporter. She has done some truly amazing things. She also has missed some very big opportunities to remain within the boundaries of journalistic ethics. Something that Clark points out in his article is, he says, although Russell is regularly praised, even by elected officials, she's scrutinized in her coverage. She does have a critic in Idaho Freedom Foundation President Wayne Hoffman, who Russell administered a rare public rebuke of earlier this year. Russell stepped outside her traditional role to write a July 23rd opinion column in her Eye on Boise blog, writing that Hoffman was wrong to use his position to undermine public trust in public schools, healthcare, and Idaho journalists. In an interview with The Sun, Russell listed the column among her most memorable of her career. Now, as it pertains to Wayne Hoffman, I was actually the guest on his podcast, his Halftime Report, the day or the episode that was calling out Idaho media. And he was talking about literacy in the media and about understanding that the media is not nearly as unbiased as it pretends to be. But Betsy really took umbrage. And so this is a little bit of a departure for her to step out of that, look, I'm so above all this. And I can't decide. Look, I don't know this woman's heart. Either her ego was bruised, or perhaps, as is sometimes the case, her conscience got the better of her because Wayne was hitting a nerve that was exposed, particularly pertaining to her inability to remain truthful or unbiased, or at least be honest about her biases and disclose, conflicts of interest and so forth. Now, there are a couple of things I want to take her to task on, and Clark Corbin by extension. The idea that Wayne Hoffman was wrong to use his position to undermine public trust. Now, that's a pretty strong statement. Oh, you're undermining public trust. Oh, my word, what a horrible thing. Or could it be educating the public that they're being bamboozled in regards to people who have an agenda to promote state-run public schools, to promote state-run healthcare, or, for that matter, Idaho journalists in general? Because in his position as the president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, Wayne actually has a duty to use his position to call into question those things that undermine principles like personal freedom or irresponsible use of taxpayer money. And that's going to take in things involving public schools and sometimes healthcare and sometimes Idaho journalists. So Wayne is on the side of freedom. And to write it in such a way, well, he was just using his position. What was he supposed to do? Just shut up and politely agree with everything that was being done in terms of public school spending? We already know that we're seeing a lack of accomplishment, or at least lack of achievement, in terms of hitting the goals for reading and math skills in Idaho public schools. Now, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be addressed or it couldn't be fixed. But are we just supposed to politely sit back and, oh, well, yes, that's tragic, but we should still put more money into it? Or should we ask some hard questions and get some answers and see about fixing the problem? Likewise, when it comes to healthcare, that's a euphemism for there were people who questioned what we told them to do over COVID. Well, and for damn good reason. It's a good thing there were people who did. Otherwise, we'd all still be walking around in masks and businesses would be closed and we'd still be cowering about, oh, do I hug my mother before she breathes her last breath or what? So thank goodness there were individuals, Wayne among them, who called this into question. And as far as undermining, trust in Idaho journalists, nobody does a better job of that than journalists themselves who give themselves over to promoting political agendas. And to the degree that those agendas conflict with the idea of freedom, it's Wayne's job to call them out. Russell wrote, Hoffman's continued agitation against real journalism is encouraging his followers to engage in actual harassment. Okay, Betsy, what do you define as actual harassment? Failure to validate somebody's feelings? Failure to acknowledge them by subscribing to their newspaper or to watch their newscast? What exactly do you what's your definition? I'd like to know what exactly you think actual harassment means, as opposed to following people down the street, throwing trash at them. You know, that would be over the line. But she's playing the victim card here. This is a standard canard in leftist politics. Why, it's actual harassment against hardworking reporters who work to bring you the news every day. They do bring us some news. They bring us whatever their corporate overlords allow them to talk about. But it's also very clear there are subjects that they will not or cannot talk about. And to that degree, it's hard to say, yes, they're bringing us the news every day. And I believe there are some hardworking journalists out there. I also believe there are an awful lot who found it's a lot easier to sell your soul in a buyer's market than it is to push against the current and to speak the truth, especially if you have corporate pressure not to. Now, interestingly enough, Clark Corbin gets something terribly wrong here. And Wayne has written an excellent response, which is published on the idahofreedom.org website. Hoffman believes the column was one example of Russell stepping outside of journalistic ethics. He never said that. That was never a part of his comments, but Clark reports it as if it were. Hoffman declined to be interviewed for this article and submitted a written statement instead. Well, Wayne is pretty savvy. Wayne has actually worked in the Ministry of Truth. He knows how things go. He has seen the trend. And the trend is, by committing to comment on a story that's already been written, I'm just looking for a little more ammunition to use against you, is what the reporter's asking when they ask you, would you like to comment on this story? They've already made up their mind. They have the slant that they're going to put in there. They're not honestly seeking truth. So it's not in your interest to be interviewed, to be asked trick bag questions, which will then be taken and twisted and edited up and turned into something which can be used against you. So he submitted a written, emailed statement instead. That is probably the best way you can do it. They're still going to omit as much as they possibly can, but at least your words cannot be twisted or you can't be backed into a corner by some trick bag question. And that's unfortunately what a lot of journalism has become. It's that gotcha mentality. Moving on, Hoffman wrote, Betsy is not a reporter. This, and he does it, Clark admits, in part. This is only part of what Wayne sent him. The full comment that he sent is actually on the piece on Idaho Freedom Foundation's website. Hoffman wrote, she's a propagandist, much like most of the rest of Idaho media. Having spent nearly 20 years in the journalism profession and 17 years connected to it as an agency spokesman, a spokesman for conservative candidates and politicians, and at the head of the Idaho Freedom Foundation for nearly 15 years, I can safely say that Betsy abandoned long-established standards for ethics in journalism about 20 years ago. She should have left the profession then. Now, that probably stings even worse than the podcast episode where Wayne and Greg Pruitt and I were talking about what has happened to Idaho journalism. But the fact remains, this is a puff piece. This is, a wonderful, warm send-off with a few gratuitous shots at someone who's actually been a very effective critic of media malpractice in Idaho. So I think Wayne should wear it as a badge of honor and just understand you don't get that kind of reaction unless, you are over the target. Now, there is one more point here. Russell said she made a unique exception to call Hoffman out based on her career experience and role as president of the Idaho Press Club, and to appeal to Idahoans to support local journalists who provide unbiased coverage and are transparent about their reporting and funding sources. So do tell, who are those unbiased journalists? They're the ones who provide unbiased coverage. And this is also kind of a backhanded slap at nonprofit foundations. Why won't you give us your donor list so that we can go and legitimately harass and dox their donors, be they business owners or private individuals? That's why journalists want to get their hands on donor lists for the Idaho Freedom Foundation, among others. So, yeah, we can say, well, these are journalists who provide unbiased coverage and are transparent about their reporting and funding sources. If they were transparent about their reporting, they would admit that they have biases, or they would reveal their conflicts of interest. And by the way, Wayne calls out a couple of very key conflicts of interest that Betsy enjoyed throughout her career, involving people like former Attorney General Lawrence Wasden, among others. The passage of the, Idaho, the name escapes me, but it's basically the clarity, the open, doing business in the open kind of act. Betsy takes a lot of credit for that getting passed, but she wasn't the one who helped to spearhead getting that thing passed. So it's kind of a self-serving thing. So if she's making this call to call out Hoffman, maybe what's sauce for the goose should be sauce for the gander. And of course, we'll be watching with anticipation to see who will be replacing. I forget the young lady's name who is replacing Betsy as the new dean of the Idaho Press Corps. But the bottom line is, you have to be willing to do your own homework. You have to be willing to question everything that is said, because every reporter in 2023, their keyboard looks something like this. Just look for how many times you see these words come up. Systemic racism, experts say. Praise Fauci, Russia, terrorist, fascist, whiteness. It's all there. Anti-vaxxer. Why is it that way? I don't know. But there's a definite agenda that is afoot. And it's on you and me to be savvy enough to recognize that, okay, that was truth. That looks like agenda. And if you feel like you're not up to the task, I'm just here to assure you that really you are. You are much more of an expert at what is best for you and best for your family than any news reporter or any government official. Don't ever cede that ground to them, and don't ever, let them convince you that, no, you need us to tell you what to think, because you certainly don't. I want to transition here to this is Betsy's actual column from July 23rd, in which she really went off on this Halftime Report podcast about how to handle media malpractice. Now, she talks about how Hoffman and his two guests bashed Idaho reporters. No, actually, we didn't. There was no bashing of Idaho reporters in the sense that no reporter was singled out as, a particular source of evil, and we were encouraging people to shun them at all social activities. What was called out were various examples of reporters who just seemed to thrive on twisting the truth, using sophistry to make a very, reasonable sounding argument that nonetheless is not true. She was especially upset that words like the legacy news media were used, and they were depicted as socialists, leftists, biased. Notice how that's in quotation marks. She just can't bring herself to acknowledge people do see the media as biased, and for good reason, very far to the left and more. Continuing a barrage of claims Hoffman has been lobbing at Idaho's free press for months. He's also been pushing for conservative, and there's those quotation marks again, for politicians to refuse to talk to actual news reporters in the process, hiding their views and statements from their own constituents. Really, is it about hiding their views and statements from their own constituents, or is it about not playing the game of a very biased media? Because there is a difference. They have alternative sources by which they can get that information out to their constituents. It's just not through you, Betsy, or through whoever, is following in your footsteps. Now, maybe that hurts, but by not playing the game, by not subjecting yourself to the trick bag questions, that's not somehow hiding things from the public. That's just simply choosing to go a better route and not having to deal with the hostility, the institutional hostility of a press corps that has its own agenda that always seems to go pretty far to the left. Back to Betsy's article, her op-ed. She was really incensed at one point when I talked about my experience of moving back to Idaho after 25 years. Now, I had been in the media for about 10 years before I moved away, and coming back, the leftward slant was very apparent to me. Now, I understand if that's not necessarily the case for some people, in the fact that when you're there every day, when you're around it each day, it's probably more gradual. Change comes in on cat's feet, and it's not as obvious. But when you have been away for a period of time, and for instance, you go away from television for 10 years and then you switch it back on, 2.5 Men is way different than, say, Family Matters. So that was my reaction, looking at, there'd always been kind of a left-wing slant. I mean, it was there, but it wasn't overt. Coming back after 25 years, I was shocked at not only how overt it was, but how hostile the press corps is toward anyone who speaks the language of freedom. And when I pointed that out, this is where Betsy really got upset. That's not true. I've been here all along, and I know this from firsthand experience. I still do what I've always done. Well, if it's always what you've always done, then, gee, it must be right. Seek the truth and report it. Okay, but just to be safe, she decided to check in with one of Idaho's longest-serving former journalists to see what he thought about whether Idaho's news media has changed its approach. Let me check with one of my cronies and see if he has any thoughts on this. So Bob Fick headed the Associated Press Bureau in Idaho for 22 years, from Election Day in 1983 to the end of 2004. He is the classic old-school journalist, doesn't pull his punches, and has deep knowledge of both Idaho and journalism. Well, I can't wait to see what his erudite assessment is. The only change has been that there's not enough reporters anymore to keep track of all these bleep expletives removed. That's the real problem. Really, Bob? That's it? There's not enough reporters to keep track of all these a-holes or whatever you called them who are exposing your or other journalists' malfeasance? Well, I thank you for that very sophisticated Algonquin round table type of an answer. I'm sure you've given us much to think about. Actually, he takes it one step further. He says that's the only difference today from yesterday, is there's not enough reporters to keep track of the miscreants, that's anyone who's outside of their clique, that try to influence public opinion with no facts and no truth. Fick added, I think you're doing a pretty good job. I appreciate that. So, hey, Betsy, you not only got a condemnation of the miscreants and whatever other expletive he used to describe those outside of the legitimate press circles, but you also got a nice pat on the back, again, from one of your cronies. What a surprise. How shocking. And how about the idea that they're trying to influence public opinion with no facts and no truth? Yeah, I'd have to see some examples of that. Now, look, I understand there are some people out there who distribute some pretty fact-free commentary, and they're not all from the political left. This points to a problem that actually really we need to address more, at least those who value freedom, those who consider themselves conservatives or who stand for freedom. We've got to do a better job of policing ourselves. And that means not spreading misinformation. And it happens. People sometimes, will go off half-cocked with this theory or that theory. It's worth your time to just sit back a little bit. Don't jump on the bandwagon right away, but see how things suss out. Maybe do a little bit of digging on your own before you go trumpeting something. Because if and when you share misinformation, it does undermine your credibility. Now, this is something that, again, the legacy media really is having trouble coming to grips with because nobody's supposed to question them. We're professionals, man. Can't you see I'm a professional? I have journalist training. Well, that's great. People who don't have journalist training, though, can be excellent sources of truth. In fact, sometimes they are the better sources of truth because they haven't been led astray by artificial rules or indoctrination in whatever school they happen to attend. Now, Betsy also goes on to say, as a longtime Idaho reporter and, again, as president of the Idaho Press Club, I'm speaking now, and I hope you all will speak too. She says, support the free press. Subscribe to your local newspaper. If you own a business, support the newspaper by buying an ad. Watch or listen to your local newscasts. Support legitimate, real, nonprofit news organizations like the Idaho Capital Sun and Idaho Education News, which are transparent about their funding sources and report news rather than pushing political agendas. Unless, of course, they are pushing political agendas under the guise of news. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing here on Nowhere to Hide if not for that agenda. That's my job, to seek it out and comment on it wherever I find it. And you know what? I always have way more material than I can possibly fit into a 30-minute program. So, for what it's worth, yeah, if you want to support your local news organizations, that's great. But just understand, they are not the only sources of information, and they're not the only sources of news. And in fact, there are some great citizen journalists out there who are doing a bang-up job of bringing things to light that, for whatever reason, either the corporate media or the people in power would really rather that we don't talk about. Now, she finishes up here by saying, I was a political science major way back when I was in college, and I can say that what Wayne calls socialist and leftist are nothing of the sort. Well, I'd like to see some examples of what you mean by that, because, Betsy, you sound a lot like you're channeling the spirit of Jim Jones, who likewise can see nothing left-wing or collectivist in any way in the body politic or entering into our public schools, whether it's, teaching kids to be ashamed because of their skin color, whether it's teaching kids, that it's okay to question your identity and otherwise, throw out every bit of morality that came before us. No, those things don't exist. We looked. And because we didn't find something that met my specific strict definition, therefore it doesn't exist. Well, I'd like to know what your definitions are. Socialist and leftist can actually be very easily summed up, at least as simplified, as someone believes that they know what's best more so than the individual. They know better than you how to run your life, how to run your business, how to run the schools, how to educate your child, how to run everything. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. She talks about how funding public education, for example, is the Idaho Constitution's central requirement for the Idaho legislature. No, actually, making laws is the central requirement for the Idaho legislature. Now, this is one of the duties, and it does, in fact, talk in the Idaho Constitution about a uniform system of public education. But it is not the centerpiece. It is not the sole thing. And even though we hear this over and over, they're continually underfunding education. No matter how much money is allocated to public education, and the Idaho Freedom Foundation has done the work on this, you'll find some wonderful articles out there that will show you they're not getting the results they should be getting. So why is it wrong to question this? Why is it wrong to actually look at the possibility of separating school and state if there is a better way to do it? And look at this one. Treating other people with respect, regardless of whether they differ from you in characteristics including race, religion, and sexual orientation, is basic human decency. Oh, well, then I guess I should probably just shut up and let that guy in lingerie who wants to read to my kids do whatever he wants. After all, it's basic human decency. I mean, who am I as a parent to question those kind of things? And of course, last but not least, here we go. Seeking the truth and reporting it is journalism, and we are all the better for it. And by the way, I sincerely hope that you found a good shoulder specialist and that your rotator cuff surgery goes well, because I don't think a person could pat themselves on the back that hard without producing some kind of a shoulder injury, Betsy. That's it's wonderful that it's wonderful that you hold yourself in such high esteem, but there are still plenty of reasons why people question. And it's this whole expert class mentality. Look, we are the experts. In fact, we saw this on display this last weekend on 60 Minutes. This is when Paul Ehrlich, yes, the population bomb guy, the world is going to run out of food, within another 10 years. When was that? The 60s, 70s? I know when I was a kid, Paul Ehrlich was talking about how, humankind will be starving in just a matter of years. Well, his population bomb has not proven out. In fact, it's been 50 years or better, and it still hasn't proven out. But listen to his take on this. 60 Minutes extinction story has brought out the usual right wing in force. Why is it just the right wing, Paul? Is it because the left wing is using that kind of scare tactics to tell us, hey, folks, if you just give us more money and absolute control over the entire economy at every aspect of your life, we can save the planet? Maybe it's people on the right who still believe in individual freedom. But he says, if I'm always wrong, so is science. Dr. Fauci, you going to take that laying down, right? Since my work is always peer-reviewed, including the population bomb, and I've gotten virtually every scientific honor. Oh, well then. He says, sure, I've made some mistakes, but no basic ones. I mean, the lack of self-awareness here is just palpable. And I got to give a hat tip to Brian Allman from the Gem State Substack. Brian says, man, if this single tweet doesn't illustrate the problem with experts, sure, he's wrong and reality keeps disproving his predictions, but he's peer-reviewed and has scientific honors. So I guess we should probably defer, right? That was a brilliant response. So here's a couple of thoughts I'd like to leave with you as far as, look, the expert class is going to do what they do, but Kent McManigal puts it this way. He says, the world doesn't need to be run. It doesn't matter by who. Society doesn't need to be directed. You don't need to be governed. There don't need to be governing policies to guide the economy or business or to prevent climate change. There don't need to be governing policies to control COVID or other diseases. In fact, he says the question of who is in charge, who makes the decision, has one correct answer: the individual. And each individual has the right to be in charge of his or her own life and no one else's life. Now, you can tell who's a statist by seeing who disagrees and thinks some government or government-adjacent institution should have control. Okay, I think that's pretty clear from what we see in much of our legacy media. They absolutely believe that it's the government, it's the state that should be in control. It should be the ones telling us everything. And that, by definition, is collectivism. Socialism is a part of it. It's part and parcel of left-wing ideology. thrown in with a little bit of fear and a little bit of manufactured crises to, justify this is why we need government to step in and save us all. I don't expect you to agree with me. I don't expect you to believe everything that I'm sharing with you. I do ask, though, that you use caution and learn to question everything that is beamed at you, whether it comes from a legacy media source or some poor schlub like me who's just, holding forth. There's a lot of truth out there. There's also a lot of falsehood. I'm at least willing to admit I could be wrong. I could be dead wrong about things. Why can't your professional journalists and your mainstream media sources likewise admit that? They've certainly shown a willingness to ignore truths that are inconvenient to their agenda and to amplify things that otherwise would serve their agenda. It's on you, though, to really make up your mind as to what is truth, what isn't truth. And as long as there is bias to be found, and in the journalists, notwithstanding, their self-proclaimed, impeccability, people like me are going to be speaking up and bringing it to your attention. Not because I have all the answers, but because you deserve to know there is another way of looking at this. I'm Brian Hyde. This is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.